Good evening and welcome to this evening's talk. Dr. Shzr is a senior lecturer and ethnomusicologist with a specialism in Sinophone and Southeast Asian worlds at Royal Holloway, University of London. She's interested in impact-based issues of music and decolonization, aspirational cosmopolitanism, and race discourses in music scenes around the world, including higher education, with a view towards understanding marginality through the lenses of intersectionality. In her broader work on decolonization, she stakes a commitment to collaborative ethnography in a development impact-based ethnographic project with transient workers in Southeast Asia in exploration of Islamic soundscapes in Chinese transnational contexts. A few housekeeping announcements. Tonight's BSL interpreter is Yvonne Strain. Her video will be visible throughout the talk and during the presentations. She will be shown on the right-hand side of the screen. You can scale that screen up by hovering over the video and using the arrow. If you require closed captioning, the link to access this is in the chat function. Subtitles can also be accessed via the closed caption button at the bottom of the screen. Once you have clicked on the closed caption button, which is the CC button, you can choose to view as subtitles or as a full transcription on the right-hand side of your screen. As much as we would love to see your beautiful faces, for the duration of this webinar, participants' cameras and microphones will be turned off. Tonight's talk will be followed by a Q&A session that will last approximately 15 minutes. If you would like to ask a question, please put these in the Q&A function, which you can find at the bottom of the screen. You can upvote questions that you find particularly interesting, and I will do my best to get to them. If you would like to tweet about tonight's event, please do so to add RCS_the exchange, which should be in the chat box now. Also, a full list of upcoming exchange talks can be found in the link that has just been put in the chat. Without any further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Tan to make her presentation.
So my name is Shzr, and I'm an ethnomusicologist based at Royal Holloway, University of London. And many years ago, I had delusions of grandeur, thinking that I was going to be a concert pianist. I'm just going to say hi to Aaron, whom I understand is amidst the audience. So I know I did promise a slightly different topic on megaphones hiding in trees for this session, but due to a timetabling mix-up, I realized that I was actually going to be giving that paper next week instead. So I thought, so that you can get your value for money, I would just do something different today. And if you want to find out about megaphones hiding in trees, you can go to the other RCS event happening on Wednesday, I think at a conference on art making in the Anthropocene. What I would like to talk about today, though, is something that's very close to my heart and my own experience of growing up in Singapore as a privileged middle-class person. And I will be talking about acoustic regimes of labor, in particular soundscapes of transient workers. And I think perhaps a little bit of context needs to be made for people who may not know labor movements, know about or the general cultural setting and political setting of Southeast Asia and Singaporean migratory flows around Singapore, which I hope everyone knows where to find on the global map. It's a little red dot in the middle of a green sea, right at the bottom of the Malay Peninsula, and it's a post-colonial state. 500 square kilometers, depending on whether it's high tide or low tide. And you can walk from one end to the other end of Singapore in one day. So it's that small a place, but it's a place that has a healthy 5.7 million population, of which 2.16 are migrants or immigrants. And out of this 2.16 million people, 1.37 are migrant workers in low-skilled occupations. So effectively, this means that 1 in 6 people in Singapore, living in Singapore, are working as transient workers or migrant workers. And by the word transient workers, migrant workers, I'm referring specifically to a category, and this category is not something that I made up, it's actually made up by the Ministry of Manpower in Singapore, category of low skilled workers who primarily, if they are women, would be working in households in doing care work, caring for young children or the elderly, or doing a lot of domestic work, housework, for example. And if they were men, they would be working on construction sites as laborers, building and working as engineers, but not really being paid the full engineer's fee that you would be paying engineers in this country, or indeed other engineers who are not migrants in Singapore. And there's a kind of gendered sharing of labor, as well as an interesting flow in terms of how the women workers tend to be coming from the surrounding Southeast Asian states of Indonesia and the Philippines. And the male workers, the men, would be coming from South Asia and primarily in recent years, Bangladesh. So 1 in 6 people in Singapore are migrant workers, but that's not to say 1 in 6 people you meet on the streets in Singapore are migrant workers, because for about 80 to 90% of their time, these migrant workers are unseen. As far as the domestic workers are concerned, most of them have only one off day a month. So they are pretty much living in the homes and working in homes, and they don't go out at night. They go out one Sunday, or if they're lucky, 2 or 3 Sundays per month. And there are lots of regulations with regards to when they're allowed to leave their places of residency, whether it's a home, or in the case of a lot of the South Asian workers, the hostel. They've got to, there's a kind of there's a fob and a swipe card, and they've got to pass through the gantries before 11 p.m., before the curfew ends. Otherwise, they would be their pay would be docked. So it's a very regulated, and some people say very labor unfair situation. And that's how, for better or worse, the Singaporean economy works. A lot of childcare is outsourced to these migrant workers, and a lot of the building, the shiny, wonderful centers of finance, of transport, of communications in Singapore are built physically by migrant workers from around the region, also from Southeast Asia. So what I have been trying to do in the past 2 years is to conduct field work in a pilot project by trying to understand the worlds, particularly the worlds of work versus play, of these migrant workers through sound. And forgive me if I'm sort of rehashing stuff that you already know, and I assume there might be 1 or 2 people who are already familiar with sound studies in this Zoom room. But I would like to channel the work of Steve Feld, who writes about acoustemology, which is a means of experiencing and understanding and constructing a view of the world and gaining knowledge of the world through specifically sounded experiences, as opposed to visual experiences, which have historically taken primary position or priority in the way we sense the world. So what I've tried to do is to conduct a lot of fieldwork interviews and participatory interactions with migrant workers, many of whom have become my friends, which has posed interesting ethical issues. And I'll talk about that later when we come to the internet. But so I'm trying to understand their worlds through the lens, sorry, mixed metaphors, of sound. And hoping that these sounded worlds can show a completely different side of these experiences. So a couple of broad themes I'll be looking at include sounded spaces and musical spaces as therapeutic spaces, as some kind of sonic bubble, a sonic pocket, a sonic haven, and how these sounded spaces are effective, and they allow people to make new bonds and network within a community. And maybe this is something that will resonate with a lot of people, and that's the first thing you might think about, how sound and music allows for the creation of human interaction and therefore emotional exchange, and sounded spaces as effective. People, when you want to go away from it all but you don't have a real space to hide into, you don't have especially during the lockdown and everyone's sharing a workstation, you put your earphones on and it's as if the rest of the world has disappeared. So that's one thing I'll talk about. Another thing which I thought was more interesting was the notion of acoustic disciplining or encouragement of labor, but via sound and sounded hegemonies. So what are the sounds that a migrant worker in Singapore might hear which may be construed as oppressive or helpful to their labor, or just kind of reminds them of something, and affects the way they carry themselves, or they identify as a migrant or not, or they identify as a worker or not. So I'll be looking this kind of acoustic disciplining of labor. And there are time dimensions to this as well as space and religious dimensions to this. Then I'll be looking at musicking, musical activity, as a form of legitimization of physical space staking, and particularly in relation to how transient workers use musical activity to actually claim public spaces, and in so doing perform the good migrant narrative that, oh, we're not up to no good, we're just playing music and music is harmless. This sort of representation of a nice person identity that is also one way to allow them to put themselves up on the platform in public space and claim public space. So that's what I'll be looking at. There are a few other things to talk about, and I'm sure everyone's so tired of hearing about COVID. But quite apart from the fact that I've been really annoyed I was not able to go back to Singapore and actually other parts of Southeast Asia to conduct field work, it meant that I had to, by default, do a lot of my gathering of data and deploying of all the new friendships and work relationships that I had started making with my transient worker colleagues turned consultants turned friends over the internet. And everyone speaks of the internet as some kind of, yeah, we are all now Zooming and COVID has forced us to ramp up our virtual engagements. But actually, pre-COVID, many migrant workers have already been making themselves very familiar with internet affordances, especially when they're writing on the back of a free Wi-Fi connection in their employers' homes, has been a matter of survival strategy. That's because they already have been living a very marginal and regulated experience and life in Singapore. So already before COVID, many of the migrant workers that I've been working with and have consulted with are far ahead of the game in terms of using internet technology. And by this, I'm not saying that they are all up to date with your corporate MS Teams apps or the latest version of, I don't know, Hover software and so on and so forth. No, they just know how to optimize very simple things like WhatsApp, Facebook, Smule, and all the backdoor communications. And, they know all the cheap methods of using and hacking existing structures that govern the ways of the internet. And none of these people actually have computers. Everything's being done on mobile phones, which also has a very interesting dimension because of the sound and quality of the phones. And I'll talk about that shortly. So that's one thing I think was a lesson to me, and how within these sorts of, they're already like 1 or 2 steps ahead of the game in terms of, familiarity with virtual networks and platforms. But in these sorts of hidden virtual worlds, you can also find hidden cosmopolitanisms and alternative cultural networks. And by this, I'm referring to a lot of work that has already been done by Bart Barendrecht and a couple of other scholars who refer to how migrant workers are very tapped into global flows. And as you will see from maybe some of the examples, they know their K-pop. Bollywood is huge in Indonesia. It's also huge in Bangladesh, but people in Bangladesh also know K-pop. They know their references to Beyonce, although they may not necessarily choose to listen to Beyonce, and so on and so forth. We're talking about a group of very cosmopolitan peoples and communities who look for particular kinds of international and transnational exchanges that are visible only to people living in Europe or Anglo-American cultural flows if we make a point to look out for them. So there are so many other flows within flows that I'm going to show you later. One thing though, with regards to COVID and the pandemic, the situation in Singapore, which I already feel is being handled in a way that's so much better than anywhere else in the world. What has emerged, especially in Singapore, is the question of infection rates. And what's interesting is that whenever there are new infection rates in Singapore, they are either through imported cases of people flying in who have not observed proper quarantines or done their test properly, or within the hostels. And for a couple of months last year, there were outbreaks in hostels and they were contained within hostels. But the figures in the hostels were a lot more worrying, and even so worrying. I mean, what do you mean by worrying? We're talking about like yeah, hundreds and thousands of deaths in the UK versus something in less than 100, possibly in Singapore. Well, maybe I don't have the exact figures, but certainly nowhere near 1,000. But a lot of these figures that were showing a sharp rise were happening in hostels, which made the plight of migrant workers and transient workers, and they're slightly different because migrant workers, there's the idea that they are migrants and they stay longer, but transient workers, they come on 2-year contracts, and if they can't find a job, they have no choice but to go away and go back to their countries, as it were, in a really awful yeah, storylining of the experience. So back to this whole COVID wrought exacerbation. COVID really showed how the plight of migrant workers was something that had to be thought of on national terms. The problem, the living conditions of migrant workers who live 16 people to one hostel, albeit a really nice hostel and sometimes even hostels with air conditioning, but 16 people to a room, not a lot of privacy. Where do you find your privacy? Your mobile phone and your earphones, and I'll talk about that as well. But essentially, a lot of Singaporeans were suddenly exposed to the ghost life of the so-called underbelly of these migrant workers because of COVID. And quite a lot of Singaporeans were horrified and then became very strong allies. Others just blamed them and brought out a lot of ugly, horrific, racist tropes about how migrant workers did not practice good hygiene, etc., etc., etc. So the issue of migrant workers, especially, now has been a matter of national health discourse because of COVID. And what I'd like to show is not just talk about the political situation, but look at the sounded dimensions of all these new discourses that have been emerging. So I talked about the 4 different themes of, sounded therapeutic spaces, acoustic disciplining, musicking as a form of legitimization of physical space taking, and public good migrant narratives. I also would like to talk about capacity building, networking and media convergence, and imagined listening, which is not my concept, it's a concept by a young scholar called Raquel Campos Valverde, who talks about how we actually look at a lot of Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter videos, and we like them. And these are all music videos, but we actually don't listen to it. It's enough that we imagine listening to it. That counts. So there's a little bit there as well. And then I'll also talk about hidden vibrations, both of the metaphorical as well as the material variety via WhatsApp and mobile phone technologies. So that's the roadmap for today. So first theme, sonic bubbles as therapeutic spaces, sonic encouragement to labor. So this is a picture that I'd taken of Yati, who is a transient worker from Indonesia, who early in the morning, wakes up at about 6:30 a.m. and follows her ward, who is a grandma, a Singaporean Chinese grandma, for her Tai Chi exercise in a park. And they actually go together. They have got a good relationship. You can see that Yati is actually wearing exercise trousers and some kind of sneakers. And during the Tai Chi exercise, she actually joins the group. This is pre-COVID. And after the Tai Chi exercise, the entire group of all these grannies, plus their accompanying Indonesian care workers, follow them to the hawker center, and some don't. In the case of Yati, she could join her employer, who sits down at a table and speaks to all the other grannies, but she doesn't, because she, as Yati has spoken to me over an interview, says she finds the hawker center too noisy, too full of people, speaking Hokkien and Chinese, and she just wants to get away from it all and enjoy the beauty and the clarity of the morning on her own terms. So she finds a little corner, sits on a chair, and plugs in her earphones. And guess what she's listening to? She's listening to the Swedish Lebanese singer Mahir Zain, who sings devotional Islamic songs. And then sometimes she listens to K-pop, and other times she listens to Bollywood. So, this is one very easy example of how a sonic bubble can act as a kind of hermetically sealed space where you can create an illusion of privacy, and you can hide away and sort of exclude the rest of the world. And sometimes, she surfs the net at the same time as she's listening to a devotional music. She's not necessarily like praying all the time when she's listening. So that's one example. And I'm sure everyone has a similar experience, whether you're sitting on a bus and you want to exclude all the noise or sound around you. If you expand that idea of the sonic bubble further, then you can talk about sonic havens, such as the Filipina community at Novena Church in Singapore. And this is a recording that I made on Christmas Day. So this is a full house. In fact, it was so full that I actually had to go into a second spillover room and watch a screen showing the actual service happening. And these are all the Filipina domestic workers. And you can see they're all women, and they're all there enjoying the service, which is conducted in Tagalog by a Filipino priest. And this is their space. When you're in there, everyone else is speaking Tagalog. And I'll just play a short clip of the recording of the church service. So I don't know about you. I mean, as far as I was concerned, that sort of sounded like could have been a church service anywhere else in the world, except that people were singing in Tagalog. But there are other kinds of sonic pockets beyond the nice, cozy, very civilized church service idea of a sonic pocket. And I'm talking about spaces that are designated as migrant worker spaces, such as, if you know Singapore well, Lucky Plaza. That's one space where a lot of Filipina migrants hang out, like all, I don't know, I can't remember, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 floors of Filipino products and remittance agencies and Filipino supermarkets and so on and so forth. And that's where a lot of Filipino migrants hang out there. And I'm going to play you the soundscape from there, which is really interesting shortly. And then there are churches here as well, a Filipino service, and people hang out after the church service. And there's this picture here, which is of Indonesian migrants who stake out a park. And parks are where they can find space to just spread out and talk to their friends and not have to spend a lot of money as opposed to a cafe that's air conditioned. And these kinds of spaces are interesting because they are hotspots for a lot of migrant and transient worker congregation and socializing. Serangoon Road, Little India in Singapore is another space. I didn't have time to include a clip here, but these are the kinds of hotspots where you can only hear Tagalog or Bahasa Indonesia or Bengali. And it's very interesting walking through these spaces because the other sounded worlds or the sounds that you hear when you walk through Singapore would be what? I mean, I've got a picture of SpongeBob SquarePants because that is the world of the home in Singapore. Probably SpongeBob is a little bit, 2017. I don't know what kids are listening to these days, but that is what migrant workers, care workers will be listening to because they have to watch the TV alongside their awards, or they're watching Korean dramas with the grannies and actually enjoying the Korean dramas. And I do know of quite a few migrant workers who have actually picked up Korean as a result of sitting down watching Korean dramas with grannies, or picking up Mandarin, the dubbed versions of Korean dramas with grannies. And then when you walk on the streets in Singapore, people are speaking in Singlish or English or Chinese of various dialects. And a lot of these migrant workers talk about going to Lucky Plaza or to particular parks or to particular church spaces and thinking, oh gosh, this is what it feels like to be with my people. And this sonic bubble is one very effective expression of this space of this much larger therapeutic space. It's not just seeing another person there, but actually hearing. And the hearing is important because the sonic footprint of Lucky Plaza is much larger than the actual physical footprint that is staked by the building. When you're, within like 500 meters of Lucky Plaza, you hear it, you know it. The same with other spaces like Victoria Park in Hong Kong. 500 meters to a kilometer away, you can really hear that you're entering a Filipina territory, and so on and so forth. And with some of the parks in Singapore as well. So the sonic footprint is much larger than the physical footprint, and that whole bubble, interesting allowance and affordance of this space for a lot of these migrant workers is really important. And so this is Lucky Plaza for you. So back to that earlier video, I don't know about you, but every time I go into Lucky Plaza, I'm always amazed. It's not just a lot of people speaking Tagalog and the whole buzz of it, but it's actually a lot of women speaking Tagalog. And, the registers of their voices are different. Women's voices are higher, and hearing that whole tessitura and a lot of voices at the same time creates a different kind of excitement. And in the words of a migrant worker that I've interviewed, I mean, she talks about how, gosh, suddenly I feel like these are my people and I feel comfortable in this space. But she doesn't talk about this space as the sound of home, because home is not just a question of the Philippines. So if you imagine a migrant worker's journey, many of these workers actually live in the countryside, in the provinces, and the sound of home would actually be what? Crickets, of a lone motorcycle riding through at night, of insects, of the countryside, of the wind, of the water, of the sea, of the odd radio going off, of people frying eggs and fish in the evening, of the sound of farm animals waking up. Whereas the sound that you're hearing of Lucky Plaza is a sound that you might hear in a big city such as Manila or Jakarta, if the equivalent in City Mall. So while the sound of Lucky Plaza is the sound of my people from an Indonesian or Filipina context, it's not necessarily the sound of home. And this whole sounded experience actually reminds us that the experience of migration isn't just, physically saying, right, plonking one group of people from the Philippines into Singapore. It's about a much longer journey. People have to get on the bus, and then there's a different soundscape of the bus, and then go to the big city, and then find the airport, get on a plane, and so on and so forth. And there's so many different experiences in there that need to be unpacked. And what's interesting is that Singapore is well known to be a garden city. It's very built up, but it's also, I wouldn't say it's green from an ecological point of view, but there's certainly a lot of flora around the island. And you can still hear birdsong in many parts of Singapore, even in some of the most built up areas. And funnily enough, a lot of migrant workers tell me that it's very early in the morning when they're hearing the birds chirping that they suddenly have this surreal sense of, ooh, that could almost be like my village. And then the rest of the day, it's a different story. So sorry, I do apologize for the spelling error there, to be acoustic regimes of labor. So this brings me to my second point. I would like people to maybe think about how sound can be a way of disciplining labor, disciplining life, and to allow us to rethink notions of intimacy, privacy, and agency with regard to spatial intersections through soundings. And I also would like to invite you to think about the paradox of intimacy versus privacy, especially for domestic workers. So they are acting in an intimate space. They sleep sometimes next to their wards, and they have to work 24 hours next to the family. But it's intimate, but it's not private. They they have to find a new way of safeguarding their own thoughts, their own feelings, their own expressions on their faces in these spaces where the workspace becomes the home space. So the work-life balance is a very interesting thing. And sounded experiences actually have I argue, are one way of looking at how their labor and how their leisure is disciplined. So what I did as an exercise was to invite a lot of my fieldwork consultants to write up a sound diary of a typical day. And this one is one that was made by Halifa from Bandung and working in Singapore for 3 years. And so she writes about, it's not the full diary, it's actually very long, the full diary, but she talks about how she gets, the first sound she hears is the kring kring of the alarm clock. And then about 5:45, she hears the birds go choo choo choo, and she actually wrote the word CIW CIW. And then at 6 o'clock, she's got to wake up the employer's children for school, and then the next sound, and that is her actually creating the sound. But then afterwards, at 6:05, the microwave pings because the milk is ready. She's got to get it out for the kids to drink, and then she talks about the sounds of her children, employers talking. There's a lot of rush, and then she talks about how 7 a.m. arrives, the doors close, it's quiet, and it's just only the grandma at home. And then she talks about doing housework, and she says it's quiet, but she still listens to K-pop in earphones because it helps her do the work. It encourages her labor, but she doesn't want to play it out loud because it could, I don't know, offend, well, not offend, but annoy or irritate the granny who may not like K-pop. Or she doesn't use too much K-pop or wearing of earphones either, because it might send a particular message to her employers that she spends a lot of time listening to music and dancing to it, but not working. So it's an interesting balance. Then at 3 p.m., the children come back and they watch a cartoon program. So that's the sound that she hears. 6 p.m., there's a K-drama that's translated in Mandarin, which she watches with the grandma, and she slowly learns Mandarin. And then, she does the cleaning and the cooking and so on and so forth. I didn't really record that bit, but I thought it was interesting. At 9 p.m., when her chores are done, she goes and retires into her room, which is usually a bomb shelter, and she listens to a Bollywood song by Shah Rukh Khan to just unwind. So it's interesting to look at the mapping of a day in terms of time and in terms of sound. So this brings us then next to the question of what do the workers do on a Sunday when they actually are allowed to go out. And I won't have time to talk about Bangladeshi workers, but I can talk about Indonesian workers. And quite a number of Indonesian workers who you see in this picture hang out in the shopping centers that I've spoken about. Quite a number of them go to parks and they have picnics, And a few of them increasingly have been going to mosques. They don't just go to mosques to pray, but they go to mosques to sing devotional songs. And this style of devotional singing is called sholuwat or nasyid. And let me just play to you. So I'm going to suggest that, well, I not only suggest, I'm going to argue that this nasyid style of singing, devotional singing, is something that is relatively new. Many of the workers that you see here who are actually dressed in their hijab and are on their way to a concert. This is a rehearsal before they go off. They actually have only started singing nasyid upon coming to Singapore. And there was a reason for this. It's part of the classic diaspora experience of, suddenly feeling extremely Indonesian when you leave Indonesia, in the same way that I suddenly felt very Singaporean and Chinese when I left Singapore to come to the UK and I became a minority. That's one thing. And a lot of these Indonesian workers start gravitating towards for expressions of Indonesian identity that they had previously, not really engaged with or didn't really care about. And many of them have become more religious as a process of the journey. Some of them become less religious, but a lot of these workers actually decide to learn how to sing nasyid and to engage with their traditional music, or music's not the word because it's technically not music in an Islamic context here, it's devotional song. Um, but they do it on their own terms. And nasyid also is a very interesting genre because it borrows so heavily from a lot of transnational popular music flows. And when I say popular music, I also mean mediated and, internet disseminated. A lot of these songs are actually learnt off the internet, learned off streams and downloaded MP3s that are shared via WhatsApp, and also via specific Indonesian download sites. And a lot of these songs are also learnt off YouTube. There is one example of a song, a Bollywood song, that is stripped of its lyrics, and then lyrics about Allah are incorporated instead, and the singers just roll with it and they just play a Bollywood beat to this song that is strictly very devotional. And they, even though it's a small room, they bring their own karaoke machine and mics, and sometimes their own sound systems, because it's part of the aesthetic of mediating their sounds. Even though it's indoors, they could get away with not doing it, but it's more high tech, it's more it demonstrates their au faitness with technology when they bring out all these extra accoutrements to help them perform nasyid. And what I have discovered is that after the nasyid rehearsal, which sometimes can be really short, it could be just 1 hour, where people gather on a Sunday, they do this. They socialize, they get together, they bring their own food. In this case, these are people who are just preparing an iftar. This was during the Ramadan season, but basically the mosques um, allow for a lot of these transient workers to find shelter in a space that's not noisy. That's not a shopping center, but in a space that has air conditioning, has carpeting, or some kind of, there's fans. You're not out in the broad sunlight on the green, on a park where you have to deal with insects. And the mosques also have ablution facilities. So in effect, the mosque is sort of like a clubhouse for a lot of migrant workers. But it would not be correct to say we're going to use the mosque as a clubhouse to do our socializing. You have to find a reason to use the mosque. And a lot of these Indonesian groups use the reason of devotional singing, of sounded activity. We are there not because we are using or abusing your space to hang out with friends, even though that's part of the package, but we're there because we are going to rehearse and we're going to do some spiritual devotional performance. So this is how it works, and this is how migrant workers learn how to claim spaces. And what's happened is that quite a number of these sholuwat groups have become very successful, and there has been increasing interest in the plight of migrant workers amongst allies in Singapore, especially people who have Chinese middle class guilt like myself, um, who will go to not just the rehearsals, but actually help them stage community events at local community centers, which are largely patronized by Chinese Singaporeans, or shopping center events or cultural showcases and so on and so forth. So, the mosque, which is a very private space in many ways, a religious space, and the activities that were designed so that to enable migrant workers to use these spaces, these activities have themselves become platforms for migrant workers to show themselves in public and to perform the good migrant narrative, like I'm a good person, I'm a nice person, I'm not up to no good, and I'm just sharing, not quite music. In the case of a different band it would be music, but we are we have culture as well, and we're not just here to clean your toilets or to put steel pipes into the ground. So that was the Indonesian Sholuwat group, but there's the equivalent in the Bangladeshi community. And this is the migrants band who rehearse and use a space provided by an NGO in Little India. And they just go through, lots of Bollywood hits. But the core group are actually, these people here, but all these other people who hang out, they're just hanging out, watching and enjoying and socializing. And socializing, showing that they're doing something useful with their leisure time. So here's a little bit of the migrant band, and it's become like quite a big hit in Singapore. Everyone's been inviting them to do all sorts of showcases here and there. Some people feel they have been instrumentalized, and there's been too much public exposure of them, and that yeah, there's a lot of critique of Singaporean allies, also riding on this sort of I care about migrant workers, therefore I go to the concerts kind of critique going on as well, which I can talk about shortly. But let me try to play. And so on and so forth. I don't know if you realize, but actually in lieu of real drums, well, there is a tabla here and a mirdangam here, but people are using drum machines. And it's a very small space. You don't need microphones, but they will use microphones anyway because it's part of the sounded aesthetics of that, the recreation of the Bollywood sound that is very highly mediated and even very much distorted in a concert hall, or the way a lot of migrant workers would choose to hear it or not choose to hear it. They have the familiarity of the sound quality that they're familiar with would be hearing this on a bus, played on a tinny little tape recording machine, and just with the levels all turned to the highest volume and lots of distortion, and that is the aesthetic that they go for. And who's to say they're wrong? I mean, who's to say the wonderful shoebox concert hall is the only perfect acoustic? So yeah, there's that. But you've got the migrants band in Little India, and that's about the only place where they can play this, apart from other designated we are showcasing Bangladeshi culture kinds of events. If these migrant workers were to play their music on their own sound systems. Elsewhere in Singapore, they would get funny looks, or people would be calling up an ASBO on them for antisocial behavior, and um, ta- uh, causing a kind of noise disturbance and so on and so forth. So these sounded spaces are very regulated spaces. So I was talking about how a lot of these groups have eventually been invited to claim public spaces at public Singaporean events, but a few of them have actually banded together. So Indonesian sholuwat singers have banded together with the migrant workers from Bangladesh to do joint shows and to uh, demonstrate solidarity across the different migrant groups. And I could say more on that as well, because there's a very strong gendered as well as religious aspect to this, when the Indonesian and Bangladeshi communities also bond because of the Islamic connection. And, people also talk about intercultural romances happening, which are banned in Singapore, by the way, amongst migrant worker populations, which is terrible and unfair. But it's not just music. A lot of the sounded world also takes place in the form of words and speech and poetry readings. So here is a poetry reading by the Filipina care worker Naive Gascon, and listen to what she says. It's a poem that she's written and received an award for, and she's presenting it at the Migrant Cultural Show, and it is political.
I wish for a trigger, filling space with rocks and pebbles in this new city, boxed in four walls and lane lines as the rectangles and blue, the sky and the trees. No more chasing or tailing games. I occupy this place. Me, and only me. In the dead of night, behind the screen lights and pointy words are collies' heads, tired soul and heavy heart, the longing for warmth, for love, drilling holes in my cold sprouting seeds so simple it sounds.
So this poem, which I thought was a um, political statement about claiming space within the the four walls that enclose her of a bomb shelter, which I imagine is probably where she's given the tiniest sliver of privacy in a household. She talks about that, and she talks about owning and claiming that space. But the fact that she's able to find a different space and not just publish a poetry, a lot of this can actually be bought, and most people who buy them would be local poets in Singapore, Singaporean Han Chinese poets, as well as migrant worker poets, and they tend to give each other copies rather than buy them. So but it's important that these poems are actually spoken in a space, and also heard, that they be sounded, because there is a huge affective um, uh, dimension to their claiming of their words and claiming of their thoughts, and placing and staking of their thoughts about living in Singapore, on Singapore land, and sound is the way of expressing that. And there's more. This is a joint Myanmar Bangladeshi dance Bollywood combination. This is another Filipina poet who has decided to wear her Filipina national costume and speak another poem. Yeah, so we've looked at all the four different platforms pre-COVID, and during COVID as well as pre-COVID. There's one other huge platform of sounded worlds of migrant workers that I would also like to explore, and that's the world of the internet. And as I mentioned, migrant workers are already way ahead of the game due to the earlier necessity of tapping into internet platforms as a result of their very highly regimented labor and lifestyles, with limited opportunities to travel, to meet face to face, or to stake public or personal space. And whatever that is happening on on a Sunday where they do get to meet will inevitably end up being recorded and posted on Facebook. So a lot of those recordings that I showed you earlier, some of them were my own recordings, but others, even if they were my own recordings, I sent them on to migrant workers and they would just directly put everything on Facebook, which seems to be the premier site of public social media exchange. So this is the Facebook page of Sakura Dorothy Manyangnan, who is a Filipina care worker, domestic worker, and these are all a lot of videos of dance rehearsals that her group had put together. And yeah, people interact, you know, and there's a lot of selfie posing as well. What's interesting with the dance rehearsals was going back to this earlier idea that I planted out here of imagined listening, because they had used, I think, a Beyonce track. YouTube actually flagged it up, so you can watch the whole video that she had posted on YouTube, and also on her Facebook page, but you could not hear any of the music. So you have to imagine Beyonce singing and then watch these people, these Filipina dancers perform it. So that's, you know, the unsounding, that's quite interesting, I thought. There's a lot of social media marketing that has already been a huge part of migrants' promotion of their inter-community solidarities and also community making strategies. So, you know, their Migrant Cultural Show has its own webpage. A lot of the coalitions between the different migrant workers, Filipina, Indonesian, Bangladeshi, Myanmarese, and the odd Singaporean ally would, you know, it all be out there, and it's very heavily signaled as migrant activism or of some sort. That's more troops that you see here, and these are all dance troops who would be either singing or playing to a soundtrack that they would have downloaded off the internet. And sometimes the downloading of the internet is really just taking it off a video that they had seen, and then they would just play the video and plug in the tinny sound quality of the video, you know, because it's just so much easier. Sometimes if they will use Audacity and just put everything through, but in order to do that, you would need a computer. So a lot of people just handle everything on their mobile phones, which I think is really quite amazing. And live streamed events pre and during COVID were already par for the course. This is a screen grab of the Gospel Light Filipino Church Sunday life worship service that was put forward during COVID. And what's interesting is that everyone is singing in this service in English, as opposed to the earlier Novena Church service, which was in Tagalog. And this is a really good indication of, you know, how even though I talk about Filipina migrant workers as primarily working in the care and domestic work industry, there are also an increasing number of Filipino migrant workers who work in white-collar jobs. And the white-collar workers talk amongst themselves in English, as opposed to Tagalog. And I remember going for one of these church services and I was asking everyone, why do you sing your songs, your worship songs in English? And then the person who was organizing the event looked at me and said, well, people in the Philippines speak English. We don't just speak Tagalog. I mean, the people who tend to speak more Tagalog would be the ones working in homes. And I think this is really interesting, the issue of sounded language, inclusion, exclusion, and class. And already you can see how language, sounding, and exclusion is a manifestation of what class you belong to, what class of migrant worker, whether you're white collar, Filipino worker, or a blue collar, or rather a domestic Filipina worker. And language exclusion is also something that is very much part of the acoustic regime that is part of the life of, the sound, going back to the sound diary example. One thing that I learned was how Khalifa and others like Khalifa say, when they are in the household, everyone speaks Singlish, and you know, she can just about figure out what they're saying in Singlish. But when they don't want her to know what they're talking about, they will switch to Mandarin or Hokkien, which is a dialect of Chinese. And even though she doesn't understand, Mandarin or dialect. Although I think by now, after 3 years of watching K-dramas dubbed in Mandarin, she can understand the Mandarin, but she doesn't understand dialect. She learns how to listen for tone, for affect, for intonation, and she knows exactly what they're talking about, even though she may not figure out the semantic meaning. So she says, I learned how to listen. I know through the inflection whether they're talking about me that they don't want me to know, therefore they speak in dialect, or they're talking about money issues that they don't want me to know about either. And I think this acquired sensitivity to a different sounding of the world as a result of sonic and language exclusion is very fascinating. And it's also fascinating that many of these migrant workers play along with the game and pretend they don't know. They'll just like, I'll just, do my part, keep my head down, and play that good migrant worker role, and not try to unstable any waters, destabilize any, upset the waters, as it were. So yeah, that's another interesting aspect of the acoustic regimentalization of migrant workers' lives. But back to social media, like I was saying, there's a lot of media convergence and media savviness amongst all these migrant workers. I mean, you can see this is a Facebook page, but it's already cross-platforming TikTok, WhatsApp, and YouTube. And these are events that are actually held partly online, partly offline. But I just screen grabbed this very recently. It's pretty much all a virtual event that is organized by very proactive members of the community who, with very limited resources, some with computers, most of them via mobile phones, managed to just organize all of this and run karaoke sessions with each other. Yeah, and as I was saying, the internet is really their playground. If you are spending all your time locked up in this, well, not locked up, you can go out, but pretty much working in a home that is not your home, where do you find your other home? You find it on Facebook, and Facebook is where everything is happening. Lots and lots of videos, and a lot of music videos, a lot of videos of people singing and dancing, I mean, as you can see here, and also cooking. But what's interesting is how, looking at it from an engagement perspective, many of their listeners or their audiences like all these expressions and these posted videos, but not that many actually listen through everything from beginning to end. And I suspect this is an experience that probably a lot of people in this room share as well, including myself. I mean, I tend to just look at the movement for 5 seconds and like, yeah, I'll like it, and I'll just imagine what it was, but actually I didn't hear it. And I think this unsounded, not necessarily silenced aspect, but a different way of unsounding and looking and imagining the sound is another very interesting way of looking at the regimenting of behaviors and leisure and private space and guarded spaces as well. There are other things that you can do on the internet, such as interactive karaoke via Shzr. I have a video here, but maybe in the interest of time, I won't play it. But this is an app which I understand all teenagers know. It's Gen Xers like myself and Gen Ys who don't know how to hack these technologies and how to get them free. So yeah, there are karaoke sessions constantly going on, and a lot of Indonesian workers know exactly how to work through them. I see Ankna now. Am I running out of time? Okay.
I'm afraid we just have to wrap up there. If you
Okay.
just like to take a minute to just wrap up before we finish. Thank you.
Yep. Can I just just give one final example, which is the hidden vibrations, because I think it's really interesting. I mentioned that a lot of the music that is being, or in the sholuwat groups and the other music groups, they learn by sharing a lot of MP3 recordings on WhatsApp. And one of the leaders of these groups actually sings a section of the melody, and then she will demonstrate and get everyone to sing back the melody to them, and she will teach them person by person, and she'll give them a reward if they have sung correctly, and if they haven't, it will be a cross. Every day I gave them a reward if any member does not send voice recording without informing me, so I let them send double voice recordings the next time. And the other thing about hidden vibrations is the Adan apps. A lot of these Indonesian workers are Muslims and need to pray 5 times a day, but where in Indonesia you would hear the Adhan, which is a call to prayer that will be played via loudspeakers 5 times a day in the public space. You don't get this in Singapore. You do hear Adhans near mosques, and even so they are deliberately toned down, as has been written about by Lee Tong-soon. But what they do instead is to download an Adhan app and wait for it to go off 5 times a day. But if you are an Indonesian working at home and you're working for a Han Chinese family who is not Muslim, then you would probably think, oh, maybe my employers don't really want to hear this weird Islamic voice go off in the middle of my work 5 times a day. What I'll do is I'll put it on vibration mode. And what happens is a lot of these workers learn how to listen in a new way. They listen to the vibration of their mobile phone. When the Adhan goes off, that's different from the vibration of their friends texting them or the vibration of an incoming call, which is very, very rare. So on this note, I'm going to end my presentation by playing you a sequence of Adhan apps going off alongside a real Adhan in a mosque when they could actually turn on their Adhan apps. And I'll just end here and end on the screen later and take some questions. So this is the Adhan. Oops.
Excuse me, the compassion.
So you would have heard quite a few the main Adhan amplified call to prayer by the singer in the mosque, and then there were a few other quieter Adhans going off in the apps. And I'll just stop there, I guess, and you can ask me about my concluding thoughts later.
Thank you so much for that fascinating talk, and I wish we didn't have to stop because there's so much more I want to know, and I can tell there's quite a bit you'd like to share as well. So apologies, we have to stop where we did. I mean, coming from India myself, there were so many things so many parallels I could see in terms of how social media is used as this platform. Also, very interestingly, using Bollywood songs in a religious and devotional context happens all the time in India during various festivals as well in India. But thank you so much for that. I'm afraid we don't have time for a Q&A session, so we'll wrap up there. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thanks to our BSL interpreter and closed captioner Yvonne Strain and Ailish. Thanks to the research and knowledge exchange team for organizing this term's event. Please follow us on Twitter at RCS_the exchange. A link to the full schedule of upcoming exchange talks for this term has been posted in the chat just now. Next week's talk will be Deirdre's Dream, a personal exploration of the Pibroch echo beats basis in Gaelic song, presented by Professor Josh Dixon. Thanks, audience, for once again tuning in. I didn't introduce myself at the beginning of the talk. I am Ankna Arokim, currently a final year research student at the Conservatoire. Thank you once again, Dr. Shzr, for sharing your very fascinating study, and I hope we can attend the other session on Wednesday in the conference as well. This concludes this week's exchange talk, and we look forward to having you join us next week. Have a lovely evening.